Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. Thank you so much for tuning in each week. I so appreciate you giving this podcast the time, and I hope the stories that you've been listening to are helpful in your own grief and loss journey. Today, I have a special guest and also a good friend and a fellow writer. I want to welcome Cameron Kelly to the podcast this week. And just a little bit about you, Cam, before we get started. Cameron grew up in Connecticut and she studied English Lit at Kenyon College and earned a master's in education at Lesley University. Her time as a teacher and children's librarian inspired her to write for young people. The Stepping Off Place, which is her beautiful novel that came out. Was this last year that your book came out? It was 2020. We lost a year with COVID.
Exactly. Completely. Yeah. It feels like a lifetime ago, but only 2 years.
And this is Cam's debut novel, and it is an absolutely stunning read. And though we're not going to be spending time talking a lot about the book, her novel is a fictionalized story based on a true event that happened in her own life when she lost one of her very best friends to suicide. And her novel, The Stepping Off Place, I'll show it again because I love the cover so much, is about two best friends, and one of them takes their own life. And the story is a beautiful, I think, journey of grief and loss and what that looks like for young people, and also what that looks like for family members who are supporting those young people. So I highly recommend Cam's book. So welcome. Thank you for coming and spending some time with us here today.
I am so happy to be here, Susan. You know, it's great. This is so fun to see you, such a good old friend.
I know, it's wonderful. And I told you that I ripped through that book in a day and a half, and I just thought you did the most incredible job capturing the grief journey and also the devastation of suicide. And so I invited you on the show because I really wanted you to share your own personal grief journey with the friend that you lost in this way. Yeah. Please, you start. Tell us your story.
Okay, so when I was in middle school, and this friend Tamsin and I met, and it was just one of those meetings where we totally cracked each other up immediately, and we became just the best friends. And her family was very different than mine, and she was such like an adventurous spirit. She had horses, and I loved the idea of horses, but my family didn't have horses. So we'd go horseback riding, and we'd do all kinds of mischief when we started to get older. And I literally, every single weekend, I spent the night at her house or she spent the night at my house. I realize now how fortunate I was to have a friend that I'm that close with, because I learned that doesn't always happen. And unfortunately, when we got to high school, her family moved out west, and I was in Connecticut, like you mentioned, but we stayed in touch, always letters. She was always writing me these funny letters of her antics through high school. And then she came back and visited in college, and we went to each other's weddings, and we still kept in touch, although we lived really far away from each other. I started my family. She had a great husband, and they did not start a family. And we got to a point where it was like Christmas cards and probably one or two phone calls over the course of the year. But it's the kind of person where you start talking and no time has passed, even though so much time had passed. And I remember having one year, I didn't get the Christmas card. And so then that year, the whole year went by. And so when I wrote the Christmas card for the next year, I said, didn't hear from you this summer. Hope everything's okay. And I would say about halfway through the month of January, I got a letter from her husband telling me that she had died the prior June. So I was months late on being informed. And then he told me it was suicide. He wrote it in like black Sharpie, and it's just like suicide underlined with a dot. If you lined up every person I've ever met in my life and told me that she was the one who would die by suicide, I would not believe you. Such an effervescent spirit. So funny. so confident. She just, to me, she was almost like my idol a little bit, even though we were best friends and it wasn't weird like that. But like, I so admired her and I just couldn't believe it. I literally, to be honest, I was holding the letter on my kitchen island and my knees went out. I just fell down. And he had written, "You can call me if you want to talk." But I cried so hard for so many days, nights, the middle of the night. I mean, I dug out the boxes because I saved all the letters, thank God. And we were prior to a lot of the internet was like nascent. So we didn't really communicate via email. We always had these great letters. So I saved everything, but I couldn't bring myself to call him because I couldn't talk about it without completely falling apart. And I started to, after a few weeks, I was like, why is this like harder than anything that I've dealt with? Grandparents, all that. It took me some reflection to really start to realize why. And I think that because you're forming your identity in those years, your adolescent years, and you're figuring out what kind of a person am I? What kind of a person do I want to be? And I think we just had some kind of symbiosis that just like, she's like a part of me. Like in my adult life, I can still trace some of my humor and stuff from that friendship. And so it was like somebody took like a rib out of me or something. I couldn't wrap my head around it. And so eventually I felt comfortable finally calling him. And I had only met him at the wedding, but I'd been hearing about him in passing for years. And he was so generous on the phone because obviously it's still so hard for him. And he had found her, and it was not the first time. And it was just, I felt so bad for him then.
Before you jump into your conversation with him, I just want to slow down for a minute because I could actually feel inside of me a heartbreak. I think most listeners know when you've got those friendships when you're young. And it's funny because I've had some friends that we were just little and we may not hang out now, but it's the same thing if anything ever happened to them, or it's a friendship for life thing where you're in those early years, like you said, you're figuring out your identity. And so few people in our adult life knew us when we were just little girls or even in that middle school. And I think suicide is particularly devastating because we all want to know why and what if, and did I miss something? You probably combed the letters to see if there was some hint in any of those letters. Was there any, all of those things that we do in hindsight. But when it is in complete opposition of the person that you thought you knew, effervescent, that's when I think it adds another layer of complexity and devastation, because if she was depressed her whole life, you would be devastated. But at the same time, you would say, oh, I saw signs of that.
Yeah. And it really got me thinking about the stigma that is attached. She was like ultra athletic, super gifted athlete. She was still playing competitive women's soccer in her 30s. You know, she did say to me once, which now, of course, means more in hindsight, but in one of our calls, she was like, my husband would really love to have kids, but I don't think I love kids, but I don't think I'm up to motherhood. And I remember I have at that point probably 5-year-old with severe autism. And I'm thinking, you better be all the way in, because it's already hard when you wanted it more than anything in the world and you have all these variables. So I was kind of like, you have to listen to yourself and don't worry what other people think. I know she had to work it out with her husband. In any case, now I look back and I'm like, okay, because he told me that she had been struggling with depression since college. And she had hidden it from me 100% that entire time. So it really got me thinking about stigma. And then that in some ways started to my impetus to, I think the book was starting to form in my head, because I was like, I really feel like I could say stigma might have been what killed her. Not
because you say stigma because she hid it.
Because she hid it and she was embarrassed. Well, I mean, I'll never know for sure. But in my best assessment of the situation from afar, but knowing her on such a like deep level, I feel like she was athletic. She was competitive. She was like a natural born winner. And I think it must have just irked the hell out of her that some days she couldn't get out of bed and there was no reason really to explain why. And I know he mentioned that the medication, she didn't like it, so she would take it and then she would go off it, and she would take it and go off it, which probably wreaked havoc. And so I think that if it was a situation where you could make peace with it with yourself, that maybe it could have gone better. But of course, who knows? So that's what I mean by stigma.
I totally get it, because I think that you're spot on. I think there's a shameful piece around.
Yeah.
I think it's less so now. That's what I'm hoping, that
I
we've
do
got the
think we're getting
Hollywood
better.
stars coming out and talking about their mental health issues and whatnot. And then we had what happened with the Olympics.
Yeah.
And the royal family, Meghan Markle, etc. So hopefully, but still, there is still this piece around depression or anxiety that I think people carry, that they feel like, why can't I snap out of it? I hear
Right.
that. Why can't I just snap out of it? And so what I appreciate about this novel that you wrote, I wrote a whole dissertation around the therapeutic benefits of writing through trauma, and there are many authors that have done that, me included, when I wrote my nonfiction book.
Yeah.
So can you talk to us about what happened for you after the death of this friend? And part of your journey was obviously writing this book.
Yeah.
And I don't know, from the time that your friend passed to the time that your book came out, how many years, because I think you said that your friend died when she was 39 years old. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then I started writing it. It took me a few years. And just like on a practical side, I was also trying to write for a younger audience. At first, when I was trying to break into getting published, I think I spent about 10 years on a middle grade novel that just was never going to get published. And I finally came to grips with that. And then I was like, I still had all the unresolved. I can't remember how many years was between. It was probably 5 years after she died that I started seriously crafting a novel. And I decided, I knew in myself that writing is a great therapeutic tool. I also took a course in my graduate program, which was around creative arts and education. One of the courses that I had to take, which I loved and I still think about today. In fact, I reached out to the professor last summer. It was called like Arts and Society. And basically it was, you would have loved it. It was looking at how cultures use art as part of the grieving process. It's once you make a monument to something, it allows you to go on, which I think that's why we have memorial services, funerals. I think it's that ceremony.
Absolutely.
That is like puts a stake in the ground, and then it's something you look back at instead of being all in it all the time. Do you know? So this class was about, they focused on the Holocaust, and then there's the various ways, the public monuments and that sort of thing. And that's where Vietnam Wall, where it's there to help the people who are living put everything in perspective better as best they can. Because of course you're never going to be the same, but trying to be able to move forward is really what it comes down to. And so I started getting this idea that if I wrote the book, but I really fictionalized it, because obviously we were adult women and this book is set high school. And I even made it so that it was during high school, because we never actually went to high school together, even though we still saw each other a lot back then. We never actually were students at the same school. That gave me the distance. And so the character that I created was like her, but also not like her. And I feel like it's a miracle of the human mind that you can somehow, like when I wrote the last page of that book, I was crying because it was me, like it was me and it wasn't me sending off my friend. And I don't want to do spoilers, but it finally, the main character has come to some kind of peace and understanding. She's going to be okay, I think, at the end. She finally is like going to be okay, because it's pretty touch and go in there quite for a lot of the book. And then I wanted to have the characters at the last part of the book, there's this pack of friends and they go off to, each of them, they went to the funeral. So I did write a funeral scene, and that was my funeral scene. To me, that when I think of that scene, I'm sitting there in the church with the family and my friends, and we're all just in disbelief and everything. But of course, it's not really me and it's not really the family. It's weird. I don't know why.
But I think that's part of, like you said, that gives you the distance to write
So I was
write through the trauma.
Absolutely going through the process myself when I was writing it. I remember I put off the funeral scene for a really long time. I knew I had to write it and I couldn't. And then for me personally, I don't know how it is to readers, but to me, it's one of the best scenes in the book. But then at the end, the kids, they were not very satisfied by that. The family in the book does not admit that it's suicide. So the kids, now that they know the truth, they want to do something themselves. And so each character who has their own unique relationship with her comes up with something that is like their memorial. So their own little thing. So each person, it's very personal instead of the church, which is beautiful and all that, but it doesn't feel real to them. And it doesn't feel connected to her at all.
And I think what's so powerful about that is that when we lose somebody that we love, I think often, whatever is happening, whether it's a funeral or in my case, it was a memorial service months after my brother died because he was over in Hong Kong. But what I loved about that scene is how important it is, no matter who we have lost, how important it is for us to do whatever it is we personally need to do to honor that human being and that relationship that we shared with that.
Right. That only you have with that person.
Exactly. Whether it's a pack of friends or whether it's siblings or a parent. And that parent also has a different relationship with every child within the family. And I think sometimes with the conversations I've had over the years with people who have lost, they feel like they have to do something big or grandiose, and it doesn't have to be that. And you showed me right before we started this recording something that is special to you that you've saved. And yeah,
this just sums up her sense of humor, that she gave me this little cat box. It's since fallen off, but I have restored it. It has a cute little heart tail. It's like the Cheshire cat, but it's not. And I've just kept it forever because I always cherished it. So I wrote it into one of the scenes in the book. So, but they're having a really intense conversation. There's a lot of flashbacks in the book, so you get to know their friendship, because otherwise. And the narrator is very nervous, Reed. She's very nervous. And so she keeps flipping with the cat statue. And so I don't know, it just felt cool to put it in there. So there are definitely some real things in there, but I'm probably not really at liberty to say which ones. But there are definitely, yeah.
I'm sorry. Did you feel that writing the book was a deeper grief journey for you with your friend? Because I'm interested to know, before you started this book and after your friend died, what did that look like for you? It took you a while to come to terms with the fact that she was gone and that she took her life, given who you knew her to be. What else went on for you during this process of your own struggle of coming to terms with this?
I was just so sad. I mean, really I was just so sad. And I felt really sad that I had missed the service, but yet I completely, in my mind, forgave and understood why the family must have been in such a tailspin at that time, that they probably still are. And so it wasn't like directed at anybody, but it was just like, I needed that. I really needed that sense of closure or commemorative. And it was interesting because also my husband only met her once in person. My friends up in Maine, nobody knows her. And no one was as close to her as I was in high school in those years. Nobody. So really, I was like on my own, and I didn't like that. And so I started to think, really, honestly, I had that class. Like, I remembered the sort of like tenets of that class that were like, make something for that person that's really like your love letter to that person. And by love letter, I don't mean that it even has to be written, Like it could have been something painted. It could have been, that's what I'll tell teenagers that I taught when I go and do book talks, is a lot of times I will say, writing doesn't have to be your thing, but if you can do something that like in your own heart, that's you connecting with that person, then it will be meaningful to you in a way that will help heal you, because you have to wrap your own mind around it. So the opening scene has a little paranormal, a weird, like little mystical thing that I left purposely ambiguous to entice readers. And also, I will say my friend loved to freak me out. Like she was the kind of kid who she dragged me to see The Exorcist. She's the one who was like into all the Stephen King books when I was like Chicken Little, but I got braver because of her. She would be the one who would have all the ghost stories and everything. She was just all about it. And I thought, I got to put that in there. So it allowed me to have a way to celebrate the fun things and not only focus on the sadness and the loss, but also the celebration, which is always a big part of any memorial. You know, there's always where everyone, after you've cried and had this service, and then everyone starts telling stories. And that's how I think we make peace with things. And it's just part of the grieving process. And so I was able to put those things in them. But then I had a weird event. I don't tell this one too often because I think people will think I'm nutters, but I, for fun, went to a psychic. And
a psychic or a medium? They're different. A psychic, someone who speaks with spirits.
Let me think now.
It's Marianne, right?
No, this was even before that.
Oh, okay.
Although that was cool. No, this was way back. I guess he was a.
Did your friend come?
Did your friend? He did connect me to. He was trying to.
A medium. Yeah.
Yeah. So he wasn't trying to read my future, but he said, and this was like shortly. I was still working on that middle grade book that I thought year 8 or something. And somehow I still thought that thing was going to get published. I was a little slow on the uptake there. But anyways, he said, your sister wants you to know that she's into this creative project you're doing. I was like, okay, I just got off the phone with my sister like 5 minutes ago. Wait, what? And he's like, your sister's alive? And I said, yeah. And he said, then she's someone who's like your sister. And she just recently passed. And it was all me
too. I've got chills. I've got chills everywhere.
And he said, you knew her from Massachusetts, and she had a Cape Cod house, that summer place. And she said she loves your son and she's watching out for him, and she's really going to help you with this creative process. So that was like before I ever thought of writing the book. I thought he was talking about the middle grade book, which had ghosts, by the way, probably influenced by her. Anyways, so I always had that. And then I went to Marianne, who's this other amazing, I guess she also is a medium, yes. And she echoed that. But by that time, I think I was already writing the book, and she was saying, oh, she loves that you're writing this book. Oh, I know what it was, is I was trying to write it in dual points of view. So I was going to have the narrator, but then I was also going to go back and forth. And the woman said, she says, stop telling you to write her story. Her story is not important. It's the survivor story that's important. It's the survivor. This woman had no idea what I was writing about, by the way. So it's a pretty big testimony to how spot on she is. But I suddenly thought, wow, you're right.
I am on fire with chills right now. Like, I'm not even kidding.
I know. So honestly, Susan, I don't tell other people. I know you well enough. I could tell you
this is the place to say these stories.
Exactly. I feel that. So then I was like, I put those two things together, and I felt she had my back. And then I felt really, it was like wind in my sails. And then I had another event where finally, fast forward, it sells, it goes in a 2-book deal. I'm all excited. I have this hotshot agent in New York City. Little Maine girl goes down to meet the agent in the city. And actually, my parents still live in Connecticut, so I'm not really a little Maine girl. But so I stayed at my parents' house, who live outside New York City, and went in for the day. And I was like all dressed up, and I met my editor in person. And it was just like this big, exciting day. And I got home, and I've never seen this happen. I'd never seen this before. I've heard owls. But I saw this thing flash by the front of the hood of the car and land in this shrub that is literally 8 feet away from me. And I couldn't tell what it was. I was like, what on earth was that? I could tell it was big. And I look in the bush, and there is this barred owl. You know, they don't have, they just have black eyes. They're like the only owl that doesn't, I've come to find out, only owl that doesn't have like the iris and a pupil. So these black eyes looking out at me. And then I just felt like this just feels touched like by something. It was like it was very strange. Then I got home and this is my writing desk. For the next month while I was working on revisions with my new editor, a barred owl sat in the tree. Every day it would fly in at like noon. It would sleep there, I guess, and then it would disappear.
That's incredible.
Whether or not any of it was true, my mind seized upon this as good luck, good fortune, that I was going in the right direction. And so I just persevered through. And so now when I look at the book, it's like, of course, it was a life dream to be published. But like when I look at that book, I don't just see the book. I see like this ode to my friend, and I picture us like tapping champagne glasses. You know, that's what I feel when I look at that book. So I don't know if I will ever replicate there's so much in that book that is just like, you know, cut a vein and start writing, you know what I mean? Like it was just so from deep inside my heart. My second book felt so different to write because it was totally fiction. I mean, you know, of course, everybody draws from life experiences, but just a different writing experience because it was plottier and it wasn't hard. It wasn't hard in the same way. It's still a very emotional book because of a lot of reasons, but yeah. So
I know what you mean, because when I was reading the book, well, first of all, you know me well enough to know that the spirit with the owl, I believe in that 100%. Animals do bring us messages, whether it was the spirit of your friend or whether it was her bringing you the owl as a sign, who knows? But it's certainly not coincidental. And I remember when I was reading your book, you write about your friend and her suicide. Is that at the beginning? Is it the forward?
There's an author's note at the end. There's an author's note at the end with some resources because, of course, it was a really scary topic to tackle.
Yes.
Especially for a young adult audience. I mean, it was pre-pandemic. I don't know how I would have handled it now. We know that the kids are really struggling, but I really wanted to honor the survivor's experience because it is so unique, like you said. And for some families, there's shame attached and guilt always. And it's just so awful. And so I really worked so hard to make it that I feel like I could give it to anyone who'd been through that experience and feel like, not suggesting that they needed to read it or anything, but just like that I would feel like I had done justice. I hadn't glorified it. I hadn't oversimplified it. I know exactly what you said at the outset, where people want to know why, and they think there's just going to be this one reason. And most of the time, it's not. I mean, mental health is the reason, really. It's mental health or mental illness.
The author's note at the end, I just remember because if you ever told me, I don't remember you telling me that you had lost a friend in that way. And when I read the book, I read it so fast because it was, for obvious reasons, grief and loss is really my deep love. That sounds odd, but I feel like helping people to expand the way in which they think about grief and loss and death and dying and helping to move that pain is really important, because I think this life is so short. And that we can really become debilitated, I think, sometimes with complex grief. And when I read your book, I remember thinking how beautifully you did handle it. It's written for young readers, but it is for all ages. And so when I read your author's note, I was very taken by it because, as you know, I ran grief groups at the Center for Grieving Children, and the suicides are so tragic for the survivors.
Can I interrupt you for one?
Yes, please.
I just want to say, you just made me think of one thing. So on Instagram, I got a message shortly after the book released from a teenager. She wrote that she had lost her cousin in this way and that it was so hard for her because she was only 12 when it happened, that she thought about doing it herself. And she said when she read the book and she recognized herself, that it just totally changed how she thought about the whole event. And I was like, okay, that's it. Nobody else has to read it. So anyways, you just made me think of that because it is so hard. And especially if you think of being that age and where you can't have that kind of rational mind that doesn't come until your brain develops into your mid-20s or whatever. That is a huge burden for someone. And I got another letter that was something like that. I've been really depressed before, but I never thought about how it would feel from my friend's point of view. And so I just thank you so much for writing this. And I mean, you get 2 letters like that. I'm like, yeah, okay.
And that's 2 letters. And so you don't even know the hundreds of other people that this has impacted, and not only kids that are dealing with that grief, but also adults who have lost children, or because let's face it, for younger kids, they don't know what to do with it. And quite frankly, we don't either. It's just such a complex loss on so many levels. And I'm just curious with you. So you lost your friend. It took you a long time to come to terms that this has actually happened to this friend of yours. And you finally had the conversation with her partner. What happened after that? I mean, I think what really struck me, Cam, with your story is that I think grief is such a lonely journey anyway, but I think it feels really lonely when nobody could share in this relationship that you had with this friend, right? There was no one to really cry to because nobody knew her. You didn't have that camaraderie around or that shared grief or any of those things.
And because of the nature of it, I felt very uncomfortable. As much as I adored the family, it felt intrusive, which is probably all wrong, but I felt intrusive because I can't even imagine. Yeah. So it was weird. It was like surreal. Do you know what I mean? Because I didn't have anything concrete to show for it.
You didn't go to the funeral. You found out
I couldn't have
later.
Conversations. And her husband's great, Joe, but I only knew him as her, like, you know what I mean? It was very long.
You didn't have a real relationship with him.
No, I mean, the person who really, honestly, my brother always had a crush on her, my little brother. So he was probably the one I could talk to the most because he also loved her. So but it's just so hard to explain to people that, yeah.
Did her death have any other kind of impact on your life in terms of the way that you see the world, or did it shift your perspective, or did it have, obviously, it was the impetus of this amazing book that you have written. And I'm sure a lot of healing happened within that time frame of writing, but did it change you in other profound ways, do you think?
If I ever notice somebody fall off Facebook or something, I'll reach out to people much more than I did before then. I still teach, and it really gives me, I see these little kids and they come in with all their messy lives. And I feel like it really reminded me of the big picture of their development. And don't sweat the small stuff. That's too cliche, but it allows you to see sometimes when they're misbehaving or something, you see it in a new lens of really trying to understand them and let them feel heard, which I'd always tried to do, but it felt very important in a new way. And the way I listened to my own kids and my friends, I feel like it made me someone that someone might seek out, whereas before I would have felt way more awkward having conversations. I feel like I'm ready to make that phone call to someone when I hear of something that's really hard. It makes me want to connect with them in a way that before I would have been more likely to maybe let it go or feel like it's not my place. Usually it's more feels like it's not my place and I don't want to intrude. And I think I've really learned that people really need you to intrude a lot of times.
Well, I love that language that you're using, because I think that oftentimes we'll have conversations around things to say, things not to say when people are grieving. And I think that our discomfort we're uncomfortable in people's discomfort. And I think when you are faced with a devastation like that, you're really forced to walk into your own fears and your own that dark place that we have to go sometimes. And I think that when you do that, you are walking into the face of your own fear. And so when you talk about intruding, I think about it as bringing light into somebody else's dark place.
Yeah, I feel that when I decided to go, because at first, when I first started conceiving of the book, I was like, I'm not going to write about suicide. And so I tried to think of, oh, well, I'll have her die in a car accident or something like that. But I was in 20 pages in before I was like, that's not the story. The story is the absolute shock and horror of realizing somebody you thought you knew so well that you could have been so oblivious to this huge chunk of her reality.
Exactly. It wasn't about the death. It was about the death, but it was about how she died and this survivor coming to terms that her friend took her own life and she had absolutely no visibility into the darkness that friend was living with. That's the story and how she comes to terms with both of those things.
Yeah.
Her best friend is gone, and tracing those steps, literally tracing those steps of how could something like this happen and how could I have not seen it coming?
Right. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think it's different in every situation and devastating no matter what. But I do feel that by forcing myself to actually, because then once I decided to do it, I really committed to doing it. There was no way I was going to try to write this thing and have some 13 reasons why. That sort of book, there was just no way I was going to do that. It's too scary. As a parent, it's too scary to think about having a book out there that is sensationalizing it or grossly oversimplifying it. So I do feel like just by the act of going through the process of researching, talking to therapists to make sure I was getting it right, I think that in itself was like a huge growth process for me, not as a writer, as a person. I feel like I'm so much more comfortable having difficult conversations with other people than I was before because I don't know.
You lived it. You lived through it. Not only did you live through it, you did a lot of work around it. And the writing of the book was your grief journey. That was hard work, writing every word, every scene. I felt like every time, every day I sat down to write this book on my brother's death, it felt like he died all over again, over and over. And the crying, we cannot think and feel at the same time. You cannot think your way through grief work. You can't.
Yeah,
grief work
Yeah.
is heart work. And it's uncomfortable to be in the heart because it hurts. But it's when our heart breaks wide open. Oh, I just get chills when I think about it. When our heart breaks wide open, it is an opportunity for growth and expansion. And that's what tragedy does to us. It expands us. It grows us if we allow it to. If we close down and stay in our head, that's where we can get really stuck. We can become very angry. We can internalize and become depressed and anxious and all the things that can happen as a result of holding that pain.
Yeah.
And through the writing, that was your release, right? That was your release and expansion. And it's just beautiful. Sounds like such a ridiculous word to use, but that process can be beautiful. But that expansion that happens in that darkest hour of our life changes us.
Yeah. I think once you have had to endure something you thought was unendurable, you can't help but come out a stronger person.
Right.
In some way.
Right. Coming to the top of the hour, I'm going to ask you the same question I ask everyone at the end of my interviews is, what does self-love look like for you now?
One of the biggest revelations to me was that I had always idolized her a small bit. And then I was left with this sudden realization is that I was the one who was still here. And I thought, wow, I'm not doing everything perfectly by any stretch, but here I am. Here I am. And so I think in a way that made me feel better about myself, that I was actually doing okay. And so I feel that to me, self-love is accepting that you don't have to be perfect or you don't have to be in someone else's image. It's about just accepting that, like, this is it. And letting go of that, oh, it's going to get better. It's going to get better when I do this, get better when I do this. And I think that's a really hard lesson to learn, and that can take a whole life. So
I think that's
grateful. I'm grateful that I, in a way, got introduced to it so that I could recognize that.
that's really, I think that is, I think that is perfect, because the one thing that comes from profound loss is the true understanding that tomorrow is absolutely 100% not a given.
Exactly.
And we always hear live in the moment,
Right.
and all of those things, but it really is the only thing that we actually have.
It's right.
It is really true. All right. Where can people find you? Give us your Instagram channel and your Facebook channel.
So I would love, I'm trying to grow on my social media. When I was writing the second novel during the pandemic, I really did not do a lot on social media. So I'm trying to get better at it. So I have C. Kelly Rose on Twitter and C. Kelly Rose Books on Instagram. And let's see, do I have anything else? And I do have, I have Facebook. It's just Cameron Kelly Rosenblum. So I do go on all three. And I have
we'll have all of those links in the show notes.
Oh, thanks. And then my website is CameronKellyRosenblum.com.
Awesome. Cam, thank you so much for coming here and sharing your story with us.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. I practically forgot we were being taped. It just felt like a great conversation.
Again, I truly highly recommend for you guys out there to check out Cam's book. It is a beautiful read. It is a painful read, but it is very well done. And of course, now the story behind it, which I think makes it that much more meaningful. So thank you. And thank you to all of the listeners. And we'll see you guys here again next week. Bye for now.